Welcome to another episode of Well, Don't Tell the Kids. I'm Janet Lee, your host, and today I'm speaking with my guest, Kumar Garg. Welcome to the podcast, Kumar.
Great to be with you.
I can see that you earned a Bachelor of Arts from Dartmouth College in New Hampshire.
That's right, yeah. So I went to Dartmouth in the early 2000s, got my degree in, at Dartmouth it was called government, more popularly known as political science, and I focused a lot on international relations and economic development. And then I dabbled in computer science. So I took a lot of computer science courses without really a plan to what I would do with those courses. But, I found it, I just found computer science really fun. And so a lot of my classmates on the computer science side ended up going and working for a lot of new companies like Google and the new Apple and things like that. And I, right after Dartmouth, went and worked on a presidential campaign. So I went a different path. The fact that I got a lot of computer science under the hood at Dartmouth was really actually very helpful later on in my career.
So are you originally a New Englander?
So I'm an immigrant. I was born in New Delhi in India. So my parents are physicians, and we first moved. My dad had a number of brothers and sisters, and he was the son who became a doctor. And so there's under Indian traditions, there's a lot of responsibility placed on children around being able to sort of take care of the overall family. And so, in hopes of sort of finding that opportunity, he actually went abroad. And so he went abroad and ended up. First, he worked in Libya in the early years, physician, and then so I actually have memories of visiting Benghazi and Tripoli as a very young child, and then ended up in Britain, and then moved to, brought all of us to the United States. And so I grew up. When I actually arrived in the United States, I had a sing-song British accent because I lived in Britain for a couple of years, but then started in the United States in suburbs of New York in 6th grade, and then went to American schooling through New York, and then ended up at Dartmouth for college. And the way I found out about Dartmouth is I did high school debate back then, and Dartmouth is a very renowned debate program, and so it's like a small world, and so Dartmouth was one of the few college campuses that I actually visited. I'd done debate camps there, and so I was like, oh, this is school that I've actually seen before, and obviously it's a renowned school, and I got excited about going. And
so you're not originally a New Englander; you're an actual Englander. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
well, we did. We lived, right. It was a very small town, and my dad got a job being a physician there, and so it was interesting. Now looking back at it, it was fascinating that I had a friend named Harry, and all that stuff. So
I see. Harry and Kumar. Okay, took me a couple seconds there. Did you mention that your mother is also a physician?
She had she was a physician in India, and had to retake all the exams and go back to residency, and she did all that while we were then in the States, and so it was quite a super impressive. Now going back to school and retraining because the degrees don't carry over, so you have to retake all the exams, and so but then became a physician, and now is a physician in the Bronx, and works with a lot of underserved patients.
I like to talk to folks in STEM fields and also women who happen to have, she probably has a tremendous story as well.
Whenever I meet, it's a teaching hospital, and whenever I meet her students, they rave about her. So I think she's got a incredible ability to, sort of teach and impart knowledge, because they're always about how much they learn from her.
What is her field or specialty, and your father's?
She did sort of a mix of family medicine and pediatrics. And so it's a family medicine program, and the hospital where she's at has a big social medicine program, which is really about thinking about all the aspects of a patient. What might be going on in the home that might be affecting medication adherence, and what might be happening around transportation and all the other aspects of the patient's life. And so it's really interesting. It's a really they really sort of push both the medical students, the internists, the hospital to really focus on the full, all the aspects of the patient. So he does like a medical floor of the hospital, everyone who gets sort of admitted.
Little tangent here. Do you have any comments about yesterday there was some words that came out of the White House regarding immigrants and such? Any comment about that?
I think the comments that have been reported in the press are deeply reprehensible and unfortunate and don't speak to what makes America great. I mean, I think, I'm deeply proud of so many aspects of what makes this country great. And, it's a welcoming country. It's a country that celebrates its diversity. It's a country where, no matter what your background, you can be part of this nation's creed. I don't think my parents necessarily expected when they were bringing their young kids here that, their child would go on to work for a president of the United States and get to work in a senior policy role. That's possible here because it really accepts everybody. And so I just, I think it's both like deeply disappointing, but also just isn't true to what this country is. And so, I think I was sort of heartbroken by seeing them, but then on the other hand, it's been a roller coaster ride for all Americans.
After Dartmouth with your BA in government, you went on to law school?
Right after I ended up working on a presidential campaign. New Hampshire is like a good way to catch the political buzz because all the presidential candidates show up. Like,
right.
I still remember that, like, I was just walking down the street and, like, I was like, oh, I think that's just, like, John McCain speaking to a number of students just from the second floor of a local fraternity house. Like, you're just walking down the street and you're like, I think that's John McCain. Like, the candidates are just there during the primary season a lot. And, that was, when I first showed up, that was the 2000 primary campaign was in full swing. So you kind of catch the political bug. And so I worked on a presidential race right after and, ended up working in a communications role. And even though it was my first job out of college, ended up with a lot of responsibility. I had like 15, 20 people that reported up to me. And so that was, kind of getting thrown in the deep end, but I sort of learned a ton. And then from there, I sort of did like a mix of policy and scheduling and other campaign roles, and then, wanted to keep, got to sort of see the political process up close, but wanted to continue on the path towards graduate school. And so I ended up going to law school, and in law school ended up working on a big case that had just started, which was the law school. There's these student clinics at Yale Law School that are, supervised by clinical faculty, but where the work is done by students. And there was a clinic that was just starting that was suing the state of Connecticut for underfunding its school system. And I ended up applying and getting into that clinic and working on it basically from the second half of my first year of law school all the way through law school and then a year after law school. So I worked on the case for basically all my time there. And it was a fascinating mix of law and policy and politics because part of the goal of the lawsuit was to get the political actors in Connecticut to focus on how badly the underfunded schools were doing. And, that's where I sort of got really passionate about education and sort of set the stage for later work.
And this is at Yale Law School in New Haven.
Yes.
You've been at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy for most of the former President Obama's tenure. There's a lot of titles going on here, but would you unpack the succession of roles that you held at the OSTP?
And I'm a big proponent of, when I sort of talk to students who are in undergrad or graduate students or other folks who are interested in policy overall or science policy, I'm a big believer in the fellowship programs because they're a great way into policy work, into Washington, D.C., into various institutions around the city. So there was a fellowship program that Yale sponsored for recent graduate students and specifically focused on the law school. And I applied for one of those fellowships, and then, this was right as the new administration was starting and was accepted into a position at the White House Office of Science and Tech Policy and worked for the Deputy Director for Policy, Tom Coyle. And so I came in, very early into the administration, just early summer of 2009, and right after just stimulus had passed. And, I have to say that, even though I had interviewed for it, I'd never done sort of policymaking in the formal setting. I'd done policy work as it happens on a campaign where you write position papers and you write memos, but not policymaking from an executive standpoint. And so it was really on-the-job training. I got there, and then Tom Coyle was an incredible mentor and boss, and would just start taking me to meetings. He'd be like, "Hey, I'm meeting with the deputy director from the National Science Foundation. Come sit while we meet, and then we can talk about it afterwards." And so I just started to tag along into these meetings, and it was a very steep learning curve, but you start to get a sense of what kind of information you need going into a meeting, what were being discussed, how do you structure meetings to really drive a policy process. The big thing I realized, and the big thing that ended up becoming my real role and really drove my first couple of years at the White House, was the president had given a big speech on the importance of science. He'd run on putting science in its rightful place. And so he was the first president in his first 100 days since John F. Kennedy to go to the national academies and give a big speech and actually address the scientific community. And so he gave a big speech about putting science in its rightful place. But what was interesting was half that speech was actually about math and science education, about STEM education. He sort of really articulated how important it is to kind of, even while, and this is what makes him such an incredible president, and I'm obviously a big fan, but he was always focused in any policy debate to not just focus on the immediate challenges that we might face, but to really think about, how is this going to play out over the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years, kind of a generational view. He said, obviously we have to take some immediate steps to put science in its rightful place. We need to make sure science isn't being censored and scientists are being squelched from being able to talk about it. But we also have to make the investments, long-term investments, in science education so that, we're building a scientific literate society, and that's important for our economy. It's important for, our national security, but it's also important for our civic culture when science and tech issues increasingly undercut everything. So he gave this big speech, and so half that speech was about STEM education, and we didn't actually have a dedicated person working on that issue when I arrived. And so what increasingly started to happen was, I sort of became the STEM guy inside the White House Office of Science and Tech. And then, we started to do these big meetings where we said, hey, the president has given this big speech. He's really issued this call to action that we need to be doing more on this. We should take this call to action seriously and really, build a set of initiatives around this. And so we started to do this series of meetings. We convened all 25 of the largest science societies in a room and said, what should we do together? We convened a lot of the business groups and said, what should we do together? So we just started to do these listening sessions, and out of it came a lot of raised hands. A lot of people agreed that this was a real priority and said, we really need to do more. And that led to the launch of the President's Educate to Innovate campaign in November of 2009. So, here I was, kind of 4 months after I started. I'm in the Oval Office briefing the President on a new initiative that, that we might launch, sort of really trying to bring his call to action to bear with a lot of announcements from the federal agencies, but then also a real call to action where the private sector and everyone else were stepping up against the President's call. And so, it was this, even though I was still, on that learning curve, it was, we had an incredible amount of immediate momentum. And, it's in that speech that the President announced his desire to do a science fair. A lot of the then chess pieces that we then started to work on got sort of set in that November 2000 event that then set the stage for a lot of follow-on work that I did. Obviously over my White House time, I sort of went from fellow in the first year to a policy advisor to a senior policy advisor. White Houses are incredibly high pressure, high work environments, and really, people sort of are there for about 2 years. And so if you stick around, I just found it such an incredible privilege to be able to work work in this area and to work for him, that I just kept sticking around. People would leave and I would say, hey, I can't imagine doing something cooler and better than this. And so, I just assumed more responsibility. And so, by the time I finished over the 8 years, I was supervising a staff of 20 to 25 people. I was at that point, I was like one of the fourth or fifth longest serving political appointees inside the office, and had been there throughout its whole tenure. And so obviously my role sort of changed over time, and so I could only focus on the STEM piece of it as part of my time, and we had other folks helping as well. But working on education and STEM education, ed tech, it was a continuous sort of arc over my 8 years in the White House.
Thank you for that description. And the fellowship, the Heyman, you were a Heyman Fellow?
Yes, exactly. It was called the Heyman Fellowship. It exists on a couple. I think there's one at Harvard also, but Yale Law, it allows you to actually go work for the government, where the government, you can offer yourself for free. Like the fellowship pays your sort of modest stipend and salary, and so I could sort of go to. It's a real privilege where you can go up to folks and say, if you just need to give me a desk, and I can show up. And so it really allowed me to sort of have a lot of conversations with folks, even while in the early days of any administration, you're a little hair on fire. You're trying to bring on people, but there's so much going on. And this was in the midst of a financial crisis in which, you're shedding hundreds of thousands of jobs every month. And the administration was, trying to staff up quickly, but it's hard. It's hard even when you're working really hard at it. And so it allowed me to sort of kind of get in the door, and I'm immensely thankful for, the Heyman family for creating the fellowship program. I got a chance to meet them a couple of years ago, and I sort of explained my story, and they were like amazed as to the impact these kind of fellowship programs can have. So I think, investing in younger people and giving them the opportunity to serve is a really powerful way for people to give back.
Just for clarity, I'm sure people know this already, but we keep mentioning STEM, so that's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So I have a quote here from the New York Times reporting on January 4th of this year that after almost a year in office, the president has yet to name a science advisor and director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Since World War II, no American president has shown greater disdain for science or more lack of awareness of its likely costs. I wanted to know if you thought this was an overblown reaction on the part of the press, and also, why should we care if this position goes unfilled?
I strongly believe that it is important that any administration take science and technology issues really seriously and make sure that people who have scientific and technological expertise are serving in policymaking positions across the government. And I think that principle only increases in relevance over time. And so science and tech issues are becoming increasingly embedded in basically all major issues that are dominating our politics. So whether it's 2017 being one of the highest years for natural disasters. We had major hurricanes, major fires that had major impacts on the American public, and the scientific elements of that to the fact that you've had major cybersecurity breaches, and the role of cybersecurity is increasingly becoming relevant to the role of pandemics and disease. There's news reports all the time around the potential that there might be a pandemic flu or other diseases that might pop out. During the Obama years, we had H1N1, we had various points of West Nile, we had a major episode with Ebola. These are not hypothetical concerns, and there's a range of issues even beyond those kind of top shelf issues that require scientific and technological capability. And so if you remember, one of the big news stories with the launch of health reform was the fact that healthcare.gov didn't work, for the first month, and that was a huge technological problem. And so, even when you care about the policies, you have to care about the science and technology underlying it. And, I think this administration is flying blind on science and tech issues. Just in the past year, China has announced, and Russia has as well, but, I think the Chinese are spending billions of dollars on this, a desire to be the world leader in AI, in artificial intelligence, has announced billions of dollars of investment on this, and an explicit desire to pass us on this. We did a big report at the end of 2016 on U.S. current investments in AI, and the report found that there were real gaps and there was real potential for additional investment. Trump administration has announced historic cuts towards science research in its first year. And so, I think this is really hurting our long-term potential. Now, I don't believe that any one person, can reverse the tide, but I think in a lot of instances, people can make a difference, and whether symbolically, the fact that this administration has basically not filled these major science roles, like the president's science advisor, the chief technology officer, remain unfilled, is both symbolically bad, but it also suggests a real lack of focus on the importance of these issues. If just as the press would be deeply worried if there was the position of national security advisor remained unfilled, we should be alarmed the national science advisor position remains unfilled. Not because there wouldn't be anybody thinking about national defense. If there wasn't a national security advisor, there would still be the National Security Council, there would still be the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But that senior role that can provide important advice to the executive office is important. And we, right now, because there's no presidential science advisor, there's no leader for the White House Office of Science and Tech Policy. There are no deputies that have been appointed. And so it's an office that really sort of intersected science and tech into everything, from regulation to partnerships, that remains substantially understaffed with no overall leadership. The most senior role is one political appointee who's a deputy CTO, but it remains relatively insulated because no major leadership positions have been filled. So I think this is not something where everything would be different if these roles were filled, but I think it is important for the science community to be making the case that this administration is taking a particularly poor attitude towards science and tech issues, and we will be hurt as a country in the long term because of it, if not in the short term.
And I'm wondering if it's an ideological, some form of Republican. Well, this administration needs to be in a mode where they're a little deconstructionist, or they're just putting people in, and they don't really want it to operate that well, from what I can figure out. Maybe they're just trying to put the onus of the burden of the work somewhere else, corporations, and on the private sector. So what's wrong with that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different pieces to it. I think, it is certainly, when you sort of take the question of sort of R&D and development, we usually document both federal R&D and private sector R&D together in the overall, United States, how much the United States is spending on R&D. But I think there's strong studies that show that the United States investments in basic R&D, in the fundamental notions of science, as well as in translating those into real discoveries, really powers a lot of industries. So I'll give you an example. So there's a huge amount of press coverage now about driverless cars, automated sort of vehicles. A lot of those early investments came out of the federal government's investments, both through the Department of Defense and elsewhere, around those early technologies. So DARPA, which is one of the subcomponents about DoD, ran for a decade, a driverless car challenge. Different R&D teams would compete to get cars, from a finish to an end. And it was only in the later years when the research really started to take off, that companies like Google and others sort of came along and said, hey, there's really powerful stuff. We think we can really build commercial applications. And then a decade later, now you're seeing all the major car companies having major programs in this area, similar to voice activation technology around, Siri on your iPhone or other ones. A lot of that were early investments that the government made. And so there's a real, the reason why the United States has the largest and most successful tech companies in the world is not an accident. The United States has some of the leading research universities in the world, and a lot of those early ideas came out of research universities, whether it's Google, which came out of graduate students in the United States. If we are not investing in these things, then the private sector follow-on investments get curtailed as well. And so it is not if you sort of look sector by sector, whether it's pharmaceuticals or others, the private sector has cut down on early-stage R&D, and so it becomes all the more important for the government to play its role. And so I think that's why people worry about the impact that these cuts can have. And so, it's an open question whether, this is part of some major plan or whether, science is just on the chopping block for this administration because it has other priorities. But, I think the reason why this is unfortunate is that, science funding has remained a relatively bipartisan issue. It's both Republicans and Democrats working together that have helped increase the funding for the National Institutes of Health and for other agencies. There were strong champions on the Hill for the ARPA-E program, which is the commercialization program for the Department of Energy. So these are, these can be bipartisan issues. It's, a real historical break, the degree to which this administration is actively proposing and pushing for major cuts in research, in research funding.
A few observations. So one, just also the internet itself that had its origins in the government, and then went worldwide with CERN and things like that. World Wide Web.
ARPANET.
Yep. Yeah, going back there. Also, I spoke with Dr. Ellen Stofan. She is the former chief scientist at NASA, and she makes the same point about the good that basic research does for the economy globally. And then I just wanted to mention also in the tax reform, I don't know why they call it reform, the tax legislation a couple of weeks ago, that the graduate student is hard hit there.
There have been some analyses that were done of the final bill. So some elements of the final bill left out some of the more egregious, at least from the science perspective, egregious elements that were in some of the draft legislation in the two chambers. So the graduate student tax element was taken out, so it didn't end up in the final bill, which obviously the graduate student community was happy about and really shows the power of their activism on the topic.
Great.
I think in general, the real problem with the tax bill is, the priorities that it has in it, right? That there are a number of really important, whether it's R&D initiatives or other initiatives that could be paid for with major investments, that the tax bill would rather spend the money on major tax cuts to the really well-off. So, for example, when we proposed a major computer science initiative for all kids, we estimated that you could get computer science to every school in America with a multi-year $4 billion initiative. So $4 billion over 5 years. So $4 billion in a $1.5 trillion bill is a very small amount of money, but think about something that would get computer science to every kid in America. You could make a major, we estimated, President Obama had a brain initiative, which was to really unlock the mysteries of the human brain by engaging in a lot of early investments. NIH sort of did a map of what would a 15-year initiative that could really have major advancements, and this would allow us to really go after, neurological diseases that are rapidly growing in the American population, like Alzheimer's, and they sort of estimated, they had a $10-12 billion sort of estimate, and then obviously over time it grows. But you could imagine, taking some of the money that was spent towards tax cuts for the really well-off and actually making a major drive, multi-year drive towards attacking some of these diseases that require fundamental research and discovery to unsolve. So I think that the real tragedy of it is its priority set, which is that you could really do a lot towards advancing American prosperity, American health, our economy, sort of with investments that really focus on investments that could really pay off over the long.
So you presently are the Senior Strategic Advisor at STEM Next Opportunity Fund. Is that your current role?
So I left in January of 2017, I was like one of the last OSCP employees to leave until, and then a few days later, the science advisor and a few other people left. So sort of helped pack up the boxes, as they say, and then left. And then since then, what I've done is really, I was really motivated to take on roles that allowed me to sort of keep building some of the initiatives that I'd worked on while I was in the administration, but then also continue to sort of make the case for the importance of science and science funding. And so I have a couple of different things I'm doing at the same time. So I'm a senior fellow at the Society for Science and the Public, which is one of the premier science societies in America, and really focuses on scientific literacy. It has some of the premier science competitions in the country, including what was in the old days known as the Westinghouse competition, and then became the Intel competition, and now is the Regeneron competition. So, it has, if your child is involved in science fair, those hundreds of science fairs around the country all feed up into the international science fair that the Society for Science and the Public runs. So it's been really gratifying to sort of be at an organization that is doing so much on sort of just working with children around STEM education, and they have a publication called Science News that's getting delivered to 4,000 high schools around the country. So that's part of what I do, which is just being part of an organization that continues to sort of engage in scientific literacy, which I think is so important in the current period. But I'm also sort of doing work on the intersection between science and philanthropy. And so the STEM Next Opportunity Fund is a follow-on from the Noyce Foundation, which historically has been a funder of after-school math and science. And the STEM Next Opportunity Fund is a venture philanthropy fund which sort of raises capital from investors and then spends it on after-school STEM. And so that's been really interesting because, it's an organization that's really focused on the fact that, there's twice as many parents who want their kids in an after-school STEM program than currently have that offered. And if you saw in the recent research that Rod Chetty put out around they call it the Lost Einsteins report, but basically what they found is if you were able to give more STEM exposure to low-income students, you could increase the number of innovators in the United States by 5 times, which is huge deficit that we currently have because we're not giving kids that exposure. So I think this is really important work, and I've been excited to be able to do it with a couple of different hats, and I work with some other sort of associations and funders as well. So part of my sort of hope and goal in this current period is to remain really engaged on the immediate and important while also building and making the investments and pushing for the investments that will help us make us stronger in the in the coming years.
I have another quote from the MIT Technology Review, an article by Emily Mullen, and it's basically that the lack of the appointment of the head. And then I was just asking about, at the end, the question would be, so any comments on forward direction for addressing this deficit? But I think that your last comment that to stay engaged and keep pursuing those ways would be a healthy way to go forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is, even as the headlines come by and all feel a sense of paralysis sometimes by the news, I think there are tangible ways all of us can contribute both to the political dialogue and in investing in our future. So I think that involves both everything from just volunteering in STEM programs. One of the programs I work with is a program called US 2020, which focuses on how to get more of the millions of STEM professionals in America, folks who have degrees or working in these industries. How do you get them volunteering the same way people volunteer in their own kids' school? How do you get them volunteering with schools and other programs? And so find a local program that you can volunteer with. There's lots of interesting efforts that are happening around making sure that science is getting represented in political conversation. Organizations like Science Debate and others are having people who are running for Congress answer questionnaires around where they are on various scientific issues. And, people can help push for, having more candidates, come out and sort of take those positions. And then, I think it's just important to remain engaged and advocate for these issues in the forward-going basis. So, whether it's, investing in kids, whether it's, making a political voice heard, I really think that there's lots of specific things folks can do, and I think it's good for the soul. I mean, I think it makes our democracy stronger. A year ago, I was at President Obama's farewell speech in Chicago, and he really spent a lot of that speech talking about the role of what it means to be a citizen, that we get the democracy that we build for ourselves, and it's only through active citizenship that we're going to get to the future. I think just exactly 2 years from today was when the president gave his last State of the Union in 2016. That's when he announced the big push for computer science education. But that was a grassroots movement. That was parents demanding that this get into their schools, and now you've seen dozens of governors take action. So in the long term, I'm a big believer that we can remake our institutions and make them more responsive, and it starts with the door knocks and the phone calls and the helping individual kids, and I think it really helps that up. I hope folks can definitely reach out if they've got questions and say, I'm active on Twitter and LinkedIn, so if folks ever want to sort of give their thoughts on what they're doing in this space and how they're sort of engaged activism and science policy, I'd love to hear from them as well.
Thank you very much for that. So that's all the time we have for today. I wanted to thank you, Kumar, for being a guest.
No, thank you for doing this.
Sure.
It's really exciting to have you sort of push and bring people together. And I think too often we don't tell our stories, and then it all feels a little bit like magic. So I appreciate you doing this.
Well, I have a little teaser for the next one, and that will be, I love stories. I love a good story. I really do. And so the next one will be from a strong storyteller. I want to thank my audience for listening. My guest today has been, once again, Kumar Garg, and I'm Janet Lee. So please stay tuned for more episodes of Well, Don't Tell the Kids.